Trigger Happy Havoc is the first installment in the Danganronpa franchise. It's the one that started it all, and by it all, there's quite a lot of it, and the entirety of the game is told through the eyes and experiences of Makoto Naegi, who is the game's main character. But even though Makoto may be the game's main character, does that mean he's also the protagonist of the story? What's the difference between a main character and a protagonist anyway? And if Makoto isn't the protagonist, then who is? If you're watching this video, I'm going to assume, and am already assuming, that you are familiar with Trigger Happy Havoc and the characters in the story and all that, like all the important parts of the game, so there's not going to be any long, overly detailed explanations about any of that sort of thing. Before we can determine whether Makoto Naegi is the protagonist of Trigger Happy Havoc or merely its main character, we first must define the terms main character and protagonist separately and highlight the main difference between the two. The definition of a main character varies slightly depending on exactly where you look and with who you ask. Many people and places will use the term interchangeably with protagonist and hero, but this doesn't help us in defining the terms separately. The simplest way to explain a main character is as follows. The main character is a character in the story whose eyes the audience experiences the story through. This certainly describes Makoto. Outside of maybe one or two scenes in the entirety of Trigger Happy Havoc, the entirety of the game is told from his point of view. The audience sees the story unfold from inside his mind, and we also see all of his internal thoughts and reactions to the events of the game. It's also important to note that Makoto is more than simply a narrator of the story. He's not just telling the story to the audience, he's personally involved in it. He interacts with the other characters, and he has much at stake if something goes wrong, by which I mean his life. He'll die if something goes wrong. So it's perfectly accurate to describe him as a main character, but is he also the protagonist? The term protagonist comes from a Greek word meaning one who plays the chief part or lead actor. In short, the protagonist of a story is the one who drives the plot forward. They make decisions that affect the plot and how the story unfolds. They often have the most at stake and a goal that they want to achieve. A lot of the time, the protagonist and the main character are one and the same, since that's simply the easiest way to tell a story. But it isn't always the case. Sometimes the story is told through the point of view or perspective of a character other than the protagonist. So does the description of a protagonist fit Makoto? Well, it sort of does, at least by the end of the game. At the very climax of the game's story, Makoto is the one who convinces the rest of the survivors of the killing school life not to fall into despair. It's his hold on hope that allows everyone to survive and make it out of the school. But to me, this seems to really be the only thing he does that could classify him as a protagonist. So now it's time to move on and determine if Makoto Naegi is Trigger Happy Havoc's protagonist, or if he's just the main character. Let's first make one thing clear. Makoto Naegi is definitely, without a doubt, Trigger Happy Havoc's main character. That can't be argued against because the entirety of the game is told through his perspective. The question I'm trying to find an answer to is if he's also the game's protagonist. Considering everything I know and everything that's widely accepted about protagonists and what characters count as a protagonist, I actually wouldn't say that he is. The protagonist must make decisions that affect the course of the story, and for the most part, I don't really think Makoto does that. I can really only think of two examples of times that Makoto took action that directly changed how the story played out. First is in the trial for Chapter 5, where he can choose to either call out Kyoko for lying or let it slide. If he calls her out, the game goes straight into the bad end where Kyoko is executed and the rest of the survivors never make it out of the school. But if he doesn't call her out, he's nearly executed instead, and the game goes on to the route for the good or true ending. The second time is, as I mentioned before, when he convinces the rest of the survivors not to give up after learning the truth of the outside world. In other words, learning that the world outside the school is a post-apocalyptic wasteland and pretty much everything has gone to shit. Outside of these two examples, though, he's crucial to the trials and he solves a lot of the mysteries, but he doesn't necessarily drive the plot forward. Additionally, in the vast majority of cases, the protagonist changes somehow throughout the story, and I don't really see that happening with Makoto. He doesn't have much of a character arc or much character development going for him. He starts the story trusting and optimistic, and he ends the story trusting and optimistic, just maybe a little more hardened by the events of the game. In fact, his trust in other people and his never-ending hold on hope are some of the only notable things about him by his own admission. In the opening of the game, Makoto himself states that he's a very normal and average person and there's nothing really special about him except the fact that he's more stubborn than other people. So Makoto Naegi probably isn't the protagonist of Sugar Happy Havoc, but he is definitely its main character. But if he isn't the protagonist, who is? The only other candidate for the protagonist role is Kyoko Kirigiri, the ultimate detective. She's introduced as the only student without an ultimate talent, although it's later revealed that she actually just simply didn't remember it. In fact, she doesn't remember her talent until far later in the game. She states that she believes the mastermind, Junko Enoshima, removed her memories of her talent because otherwise she would have been too much of a threat to the killing game. Although I am forced to question how accurate this assumption is because it seems like removing her memories of being the ultimate detective didn't make her any less intelligent. She was just as smart before and after remembering her talent. But all that is besides the point. Kyoko is the only character who actively tries to solve the mysteries of the school and why the students are trapped there. Makoto does help her, but he wasn't the first to try to figure out what was going on. Kyoko is also crucial in the trials where she's shown to easily be the smartest person there. She can offer valuable insight into each case, such as the culprit's true motivation. Additionally, Kyoko has a goal she wants to achieve. She originally came to Hope's Peak Academy because she wanted to confront her father, the headmaster of the school, and cut all ties with him for what she saw as abandoning her as a child. Her relationship with her father is a very crucial part of her character and a source of great inner conflict for Kyoko. She clearly holds a lot of anger and resentment towards him for not being in her life, but later on in the game, when his bones are discovered in his office and she sees a photo of herself with her father from when she was young, she seems very upset and confused. Kyoko struggles between her resentment towards her father for abandoning her and a wish for what could have been had he remained in her life. Kyoko also changes throughout the story. She's at first very cold, reserved, and closed off, but through her relationship with Makoto and her interactions with him, she starts to open up. She confides in him about things that she seems to have never told anyone else. Largely a distrusting person, she comes to trust Makoto enough to let him aid her in solving the school's mysteries. And finally, Kyoko's fate greatly matters to the story. In the bad end, when she dies, the story truly ends. The other survivors never escape the school, nor does Makoto continue looking into the mysteries of the school. If I recall correctly, which I might not be because I have a terrible memory, Kyoko even states during the trial in Chapter 5 that if she dies, the mystery of the school dies with her. So, by my interpretation, I believe it is more accurate to say Kyoko is the protagonist of Trigger Happy Havoc, while Makoto is the main character. She goes through more changes and makes more active choices and decisions than Makoto, who is a rather flat character. Crafting a decent story where the protagonist and the main character are separated into two different characters is far from easy. Since the protagonist is the driving force behind the story and its plot, it usually makes sense to tell it from their point of view. But that isn't always the case. There are some classic examples of the main character and protagonist being different, for example The Great Gatsby or To Kill a Mockingbird. Telling the story through another character's eyes can offer unique insight into the story as well as the protagonist. Because Kyoko is so reclusive and distrustful throughout most of the game, if the story were told from her point of view, we wouldn't see nearly as much of the other characters as we do through Makoto's eyes and his free time events with them. There's also an interesting subversion of expectations in centering the story around the most normal and average person out of a cast of interesting and unusual characters. Plus, by seeing the story through Makoto's point of view, we get to see Kyoko from the outside. As the audience, we get to see her gradual change throughout the story. And if we saw the story through Kyoko's eyes, a lot of the mysteries and questions that the audience may have could be solved and answered very easily, which is not exactly great for a game centered around mysteries. I think it's interesting to have Kyoko as the protagonist while Makoto is the main character. It lets the audience experience the events of a story in a way that they otherwise wouldn't had it been told from Kyoko's perspective. So that's my interpretation of things. Kyoko Kirigiri is the protagonist of Trigger Happy Havoc, while Makoto Naegi is the main character. But that's only how I see things. This sort of thing is pretty much completely up to interpretation. What do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think Kyoko's the protagonist, or do you believe it's Makoto? Are they both the protagonists, or is it somehow neither of them? And if you think it's neither of them, who do you think it is? I would love to know your thoughts on this, so feel free to share them. Just be respectful and polite, please. There's no need to be rude. And at this point in the script, I just wrote improvised outro here, because I always improvise my outros, but I swear I'm going to try to keep this one short and snappy. Thank you for watching. This was pretty fun to make. I had this idea randomly at about 1:30 and 2 in the morning, and just banged out the script real quick, and here it is. It's recorded now. So thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. I enjoyed. Have a great day. Drink some water, take care of yourself, and be nice to yourself, and that's all I've got.